On the morning of the 19th of August, 1966, a group of exhausted Australian soldiers walked back into a rubber plantation they had been driven out of the night before and found 13 of their friends lying exactly where they had died. The men were still in their firing positions. Their weapons were still pointed forward. Their fingers were still on the triggers. The rain had washed over them through the long night, and in the flat gray light of the morning they looked, for just a moment, as though they might stand up. They had been holding a line against a force that outnumbered them by something close to 20-1, and they had gone on holding it well past the point where holding made any sense at all, and they had died facing the direction the enemy was coming from. The afternoon before, 108 Australians and New Zealanders had stood against an enemy estimated, by their own side, as high as 2,500 men, in the middle of a monsoon, 5 kilometers from a base whose own commander spent that night convinced the entire company had been wiped out. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of Delta Company and the Battle of Long Tan before today? Because what you are about to discover will change the way you understand the war that Australia spent the next 40 years trying to decide how to remember. Now let's go. To understand how 108 men came to be holding a rubber plantation against a regiment, you must first understand how they were chosen to be there at all. Most of them had not volunteered for anything. On the 24th of November, 1964, the Australian Parliament passed the National Service Act, and with it, a system that selected 20-year-old men for the Army, not by enlistment, not by appeal to patriotism, not by any judgment of their fitness for war, but by a ballot of birthdays drawn from a barrel. If your date came out of the barrel, you served. 2 years in the regular Army, and then 3 more in the reserve. And from March of 1966, under the government of Harold Holt, the possibility of being sent to fight in Vietnam. So a generation of ordinary young men discovered that the accident of when they had been born might decide whether they lived or died in a country most of them could not have found on a map. Some 19,000 of them would go to Vietnam. That task force planted itself in the worst possible place, and it did so on purpose. In June of 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force established its base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Toi Province, in country that the Viet Cong had owned and taxed and recruited from for years. The intention was deliberate and even bold. The Australians meant to sit down in the middle of the enemy's own heartland and contest it, to clear a circle of ground around the base, to push the insurgents back from the population they fed on. What the planners in their headquarters could not yet see was how completely the enemy had registered their arrival, and how quickly the contest would come looking for them. The first weeks at Nui Dat settled into a grinding, sodden routine that the diggers would remember long after the politics had faded. A 3-day cycle of all-day patrols and night ambushes and standing watch in waterlogged weapon pits, of bailing the rain out of those pits every afternoon when the heavens opened, as if on a timetable, of heat and dust and mud and boredom and the low, constant hum of a threat that almost never showed itself. Operation after operation went out chasing reports of large enemy forces and came back having found nothing of consequence, until the men developed a hard cynicism about intelligence and the word that an attack was coming, a sense that the brass were forever crying wolf. The wolf, as it happened, was real, and it was very close. In the days before the battle, an Australian company patrolling north of the Long Tan plantation found unmistakable signs of an enemy presence, and in a series of small contacts, killed an enemy soldier who appeared to be an officer, a man carrying details connected to the firing of mortars, and who was wearing the green uniform of a regular rather than the black of a local guerrilla. The significance of that uniform would not become clear to everyone until later. Then, in the small hours of the 17th of August, the enemy answered the Australian gamble in the most direct language available to him. For something over 20 minutes, he poured mortar and recoilless rifle fire onto the Nui Dat base, more than 80 rounds in all, walking the explosions across the artillery lines and the engineer positions and the command post with an accuracy that spoke of careful preparation, wounding 24 Australians, one of whom lost a leg, damaging vehicles and tents, and then withdrawing into the dark before the counter-fire could find him. By the standards of the battle that was coming, it was a small attack. But it was an act of war on the Australians' own ground, and they read it the only way soldiers can read such a thing. They sent men out to find the people who had done it. That decision, ordinary and almost automatic, set everything else in motion. The battalion they drew the men from had been born in Brisbane. The 6th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment was raised at Inagara Barracks on the 6th of June, 1965, formed by splitting an older battalion in two and building it up with a large draft of those first national servicemen. And like every infantry battalion of that era, it was a marriage of two kinds of soldier who did not always understand each other. There were the regulars, men who had chosen soldiering as a trade and a life, and there were the conscripts, the ones the draw had taken, and in their civilian lives, the lives the ballot had interrupted, they had been butchers and clerks and storemen and laborers, apprentice electricians and farmhands and blinds installers, and, in at least one case, a university student who had not yet finished his degree. They were the ordinary working young men of a country that had not yet made up its mind about the war it was sending them to. They were not a famous veteran formation hardened by years of combat. For most of them, Long Tan would be the first real battle of their lives. Delta Company numbered 108 men on the day it mattered, and 3 of those were not Australians at all, but New Zealand gunners, a small forward observation party whose presence would turn out to matter more than anyone could possibly have guessed. Their commander, Major Harry Smith, was not an easy man to serve under or to like. Born in Hobart in 1933, he had joined the school cadets as a boy, gone through national service himself, and then, rather than leave, enlisted as a private soldier and earned his commission at the officer school at Port C. He had fought as a young platoon commander in the Malayan emergency, 2 years of hard jungle soldiering against communist insurgents, and he had trained with the commandos, and all of it had left him exacting, abrasive, impatient with incompetence, and quietly certain that the chain of command above him could not be relied upon to look after the men below. He did not yet know how thoroughly events would prove him right. Beside him stood a man cut from entirely different cloth, the company sergeant major, Warrant Officer John Kirby, a Sydney motor mechanic by trade, who had gone to Korea as a young soldier and risen, by 1966, to become the steadying heart of Delta Company. The men called him Big Jack. He was older than them and heavier than them, and on the training runs around Nui Dat, he could not keep up with the lean young soldiers and the short, hard-driving major, and he plugged along at the back and finished every time, and the men loved him for it. He was, as one of them put it, part father, part teacher, part headmaster, and entirely without fear, and he would prove all 3 things in the rubber. In the forward platoons were the others, whose names the afternoon would carve permanently into the record. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, 21 years old, a national serviceman who in civilian life had been a television cameraman, commanded 11 platoon, and there was friction between him and his platoon sergeant, a regular soldier named Bob Buick, the 2 of them having clashed so badly the night before the battle that a charge had been threatened. Jeff Kendall, another young officer, led 10 platoon, Dave Sabin, 21, and a national serviceman who had been an advertising layout artist in Sydney before the call-up found him, led 12. Attached to the company headquarters was the New Zealand forward observer, Captain Maurice Stanley, a quiet, careful man whose entire job was to talk to the guns, and whose nerve, in the hours to come, would hold the line as surely as any rifle. And moving among all of them, when the time came, would be Kirby, and the medic, Corporal Phil Dobson, who would set up an aid post in a shallow scrape in the mud, and, before the night was over, treat 23 wounded men without losing a single one of them. There is one more fact about Delta Company that has to be fixed firmly in mind before the shooting starts, because it would shape everything that followed. Each of these riflemen walked into the plantation carrying very little ammunition. 3 magazines of 20 rounds, 1 in the weapon and 2 on the belt, with perhaps 60 more rounds packed away in a box in his pack. It was a normal load for what everyone expected to be a normal patrol. It was nowhere near enough for what was actually waiting in the rubber, and the gap between the two, between what they carried and what they would need, would very nearly cost every one of them his life. The cruelty of the day Delta Company drew is that it began as a celebration. That afternoon, the 18th of August, the task force was to be given its first proper concert since arriving in Vietnam, a genuine and rare treat in the grinding monotony of base life, headlined by the 17-year-old Australian pop singer known to everyone as Little Patty, and the band leader, Carl Joy, and his band. The men had been looking forward to it for days, and it was Delta Company that drew the patrol instead. They were ordered out to follow up the mortar attack, to find the firing positions, to chase down the enemy who had melted away into the country, and to relieve another company already in the field, all of it under the flat, unremarkable code name, Operation Vendetta. They walked out of Nui Dat at 11 o'clock in the morning, with the sound of the concert rehearsals drifting across the base behind them, and a good many of them were sour about it, convinced that their company had drawn the short straw yet again, half persuaded that the strained relationship between their major and the battalion's commanding officer had something to do with which company got the concert and which got the rubber. What none of them carried with them into the trees was the one piece of knowledge that might have changed the way they walked. For weeks, a secret Australian radio tracking unit at Nui Dat had been following the transmissions of an enemy regimental radio as it moved steadily closer to the Long Ton area, and because radios at that level meant a major formation, the men reading those signals understood that something large was gathering nearby. The warnings had been made. An Australian intelligence officer had argued, repeatedly and with mounting urgency, that a main force enemy unit was massing within striking distance of the base. But by a stroke of timing so unlucky it reads almost like invention, that officer had been hospitalized in the days before the battle, and the task force's other senior intelligence officer had been evacuated as well, struck down by illness, so that the 2 men best placed to ring the alarm at the decisive moment were lying in hospital beds, while Delta Company laced up its boots. The soldiers followed the enemy's tracks into the plantation, believing they were chasing a beaten remnant. They had no way of knowing the tracks led toward a regiment. The music followed them a little way through the trees, thin and incongruous under the heavy sky. And then it did not. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Delta Company entered the Long Ton rubber plantation, a place of mature trees standing in long ordered rows, the ground beneath them open and clear of undergrowth, the light falling in straight gray bars between the trunks. The company was spread wide, its platoon separated by a couple of 100 meters of open rubber, which was a sensible formation for a patrol covering ground, and a dangerous one for a company about to be hit by a regiment. At 20-4, the leading platoon, Sharp's 11 platoon, made contact at a track crossing. A small group of enemy, no more than a handful of men, appeared among the trees and broke and ran, and the Australians killed one of them and recovered his rifle, and Sharp came on the radio and asked his major for permission to follow up. Permission was given. The platoon pushed forward after the fleeing men, deeper into the plantation, the way infantry has pushed after a beaten enemy in 100 earlier wars, and the contact had every appearance of the brief, sharp, inconclusive skirmish the diggers had grown used to and grown cynical about. The men who had spent weeks chasing intelligence reports into empty jungle had every reason to expect this one to fade the same way. It was not a skirmish. At 4:08, the front of 11 platoon was ripped open by machine gun fire from a force that had been moving toward them, or waiting for them, or both, in numbers no one on the Australian side had imagined possible. 2 men went down dead in the first seconds. The left-hand section hit so hard it was almost destroyed where it stood. The handful of enemy the platoon had chased had been only the leading edge of something vast, and the platoon, pushing forward, had run straight into the body of it. There was one detail in those opening moments that told the Australians, with absolute clarity, exactly how much trouble they were in. The dead enemy at the track crossing, and the men now firing on them from the trees, were wearing green. The local Viet Cong fought in black pajamas. Green uniforms meant North Vietnamese regulars, main force soldiers, the disciplined professional heart of the enemy army, and their presence in these numbers meant Delta Company had not blundered into a band of part-time guerrillas, but into a regiment moving with purpose. 5 kilometers away at the task force headquarters, a junior officer at the operations desk heard the description of the green uniforms come across the radio and grasped its meaning before almost anyone else in the room, and went at once to fetch his commander. Out in the rubber, Captain Stanley was already calling for fire. By 4:12, the first New Zealand shells were dropping among the enemy, and the attack was coming on in waves of 50 and 100 men at a time, from the front, from the flanks, from 3 sides at once, and the 200 meters of open rubber between 11 platoon and the rest of the company had become the loneliest stretch of ground in Vietnam. At 4:33, a bullet found Gordon Sharp's throat. The young television cameraman who had been a soldier for barely more than a year died trying to organize the defense of his platoon, and command passed in an instant to the sergeant he had quarreled with the night before, Bob Buick, who now found himself running a platoon that was being torn apart around him. The bare numbers tell it more plainly than any description could. 11 platoon had gone into the rubber with 29 men. By the time the long afternoon was over, the overwhelming majority of them would be dead or wounded, and the platoon would suffer the highest casualty rate of any Australian platoon in the entire Vietnam War. Buick's men were very nearly surrounded, struck from 3 directions, and at one point a burst of fire shot the antenna clean off their radio, so that for stretches of the fight, they could not even call for help or correct the artillery falling around them. And as the minutes dragged on, they began to run out of the one thing keeping them alive. They had not been carrying enough ammunition. 60 rounds in a man's magazines is a great deal until 100 men are walking toward you through the trees, and then it is nothing at all. Soldiers fired their last rounds and lay flat in the mud with empty weapons, and some of them, with nothing left to shoot, began to cheer the artillery as it crashed down among the enemy ranks, because cheering was the only weapon they had left to fight with. And then the sky opened. At around 5:10, the monsoon broke over the plantation, with a violence the survivors would describe for as long as they lived, a vertical wall of warm rain so heavy it turned the afternoon to twilight. So heavy it pressed the gun smoke down among the trees and would not let it rise. So heavy that the low cloud it dragged across the sky made effective close air support impossible for the rest of the day. American jets did come and tried, but in the murk and the smoke, they could not tell the Australians from the enemy, and after one pass that risked as much harm to friend as to foe, the Major waved them off and put his faith back in the guns. The rain filled the men's boots and ran into their eyes and worked its way into the actions of their rifles, and mud began to seize the moving parts, so that more than one digger found himself forcing each round into the breech of his weapon by hand, one at a time, in the middle of a battle for his life. To the 2 forward platoons, the Major now committed his others. He sent Kendall's 10 platoon forward to help, and then Sabin's 12, and each of them, advancing across open rubber toward a fight they could hear long before they could see it, was struck in turn and pinned, so that the company was being chewed apart a platoon at a time, every move to relieve the trapped men drawing fresh fire and fresh casualties. A young radio operator was shot through the shoulder as he called in artillery, the same bullet smashing the radio and taking it off the air. Another, getting to his feet to move, was killed the moment he rose. Through all of it moved Big Jack Kirby, walking the perimeter, while other men pressed themselves flat into the mud, carrying ammunition forward to the platoons, dragging the wounded back to Dobson's aid post, crouching beside a frightened private to drop a handful of rounds at his side, and ask him, in the flat, unbothered voice of a man discussing nothing in particular, whether he was all right and doing a good job. When a soldier began to come apart under the strain, Kirby would put one large hand on his shoulder and tell him, without heat, that he was being paid to do a job, and here was his chance to earn his money and get over there. It was theater, and it was deadly serious, and it held the company together at the moments it might otherwise have flown apart. By 5:15, Buick's reports to his major had stopped pretending. His platoon was desperate, almost surrounded, almost out of ammunition, down to a handful of men still able to fight, and there was nothing in the spare professional language of soldiers that could make the situation sound like anything other than what it was. Out in the rubber beyond the platoons, men who had been cut off in the chaos began the long, terrifying business of trying to crawl back to the company alone. One sergeant, Paddy Todd, his ankles shattered by a mortar that had landed beside him, dragged himself through the rain and the mud toward the company position, and when at last the Australians ahead of him mistook him for the enemy and fired, he waved his hat and bellowed his own name at them until they understood, and 2 men ran out under fire and carried him in. What saved Delta Company in those hours was not its rifles. It was the guns, and to understand the guns, you have to leave the plantation and travel 5 kilometers west, back to Nui Dat, where the artillery was fighting a desperate battle of its own. Behind the company stood 24 guns, 3 batteries firing the lighter shells, 1 Australian and 1 from New Zealand, and a 3rd in support, and an American battery firing the big 155mm rounds, and across the afternoon and evening, those guns hurled something on the order of 3,500 shells into the enemy. The man directing them was Captain Stanley, and the task he had been handed grew more impossible by the minute, because the only way to break the waves of attackers was to bring the falling shells closer and closer to the Australians themselves until they were landing 50 meters in front of the soldiers, and then 30, near enough that the men could feel the concussion through the ground and hear the fragments singing over their heads, near enough that a single error of calculation would have slaughtered the very men the fire was meant to save. At one point, Buick, certain his platoon was about to be overrun, called for the artillery to be dropped directly onto his own position, and Stanley, holding his nerve, kept it just far enough out to kill the enemy without killing the platoon. Twice the strain became almost too much, and the New Zealander called a halt to the fire in fear of hitting the Australians, and twice a fellow gunner's steady voice on the radio talked him back to the guns. At the height of it, the whole line fired together, every gun at once, a regimental fire mission, of a kind the Australian Army had not carried out since the Korean War, and would likely never carry out again. The gun line paid for every shell. The same monsoon that was drowning Delta Company sat directly over Nui Dat, and lightning struck the gun positions twice, once exploding a fuel drum, and once knocking out the loudspeaker system the gunners used to pass their fire orders and hurling a switchboard operator clean across the floor, so that the orders had to be relayed by men shouting down a human chain from gun to gun. The fumes from the firing, which on an ordinary day would have drifted off on the breeze, hung in the dead still wet air and thickened around the crews until two gunners passed out where they stood, overcome by the cordite they could not escape. Every spare man at the base, cooks and clerks and drivers, formed lines to keep the shells moving to the guns, which were firing so fast and so long that the empty cases piled up around them faster than they could be kicked clear. This was what holding Long Tan actually looked like in those hours, and it was nothing like the clean heroics of a film. It was men choking on their own gun smoke in the rain, half-blinded, deafened, passing shells hand to hand and round by round, because there were soldiers 5 kilometers away in the rubber, whose lives were being measured in the gap between one shell and the next. Even the guns were not enough on their own, because Delta Company was running out of ammunition and would soon have nothing left to fire. And so the major did 2 things at once. He got on the radio and demanded that the artillery be brought down exactly where he wanted it, or his entire company would be lost, swearing at the men at the fire control center with the raw desperation of a commander watching the arithmetic close around him. And he called for an emergency ammunition resupply, knowing it could only come by helicopter, knowing the helicopters would have to fly into the middle of an active battle in the heart of a monsoon. At the headquarters there was a furious argument, because the standing orders forbade flying into an unsecured area exactly like this one. And into the middle of that argument, the task force commander spoke the words that ended it, observing with terrible calm that he was about to lose an entire company. So what in God's name did a few more helicopters and a few more pilots matter now? 2 Air Force pilots who had been listening to the battle unfold over their own radio said they would fly, and would fly alone if they had to. They lifted off into the storm and flew at the height of the treetops, with their visibility down to perhaps 50 meters. The rain so heavy it threatened to flame out their engines, and they found the small clearing in the rubber by the smoke the soldiers threw. And there was a moment of confusion when they saw the wrong color of smoke and had to go around again. And then they came back and pushed boxes of ammunition out into the storm so accurately that one of them dropped almost into Big Jack Kirby's lap and very nearly killed the man it was meant to resupply. With that ammunition, the company drew itself into a tight all-round defense. Every platoon together at last. The wounded gathered in the center under Dobson's care, and it waited for what everyone knew was coming. It came at last light, and it came in waves. From around 6:30, the enemy threw himself at the Australian position in mass assaults, 2 long lines of 60 to 100 men at a time, the front rank walking into the rifles, while the artillery shredded the rank coming up behind it. The attacks heralded each time by whistles and bugles sounding through the trees. The worst of the killing came not from the charging waves at all, but from the enemy soldiers who had crawled in close and gone to ground among the dead and the rubber roots, sniping at any Australian who lifted his head to fire. Into one of those moments, Kirby ran the way he had been running all afternoon. He saw an enemy machine gun crew setting up barely 50 meters from the perimeter, close enough to sweep the entire Australian line and roll it up. and he lunged out beyond the position alone, and killed the crew, and put the gun out of the fight, and came back. And it is entirely possible that this single act, more than any other, is the reason that anyone in Delta Company lived to tell the story. Whistles, bugles, the rain, the guns. The men fired until their barrels scorched, and the mud jammed their actions, and they cleared them with their fingers and fired again. And the perimeter bent and held, and bent and held, and for all the weight the enemy threw at it, it would not break. What finally broke the enemy was the sound of engines. The relief had been grinding toward them for hours. A troop of armored personnel carriers under a young lieutenant named Adrian Roberts, carrying a company of infantry forward to the fight, and its journey had been a small ordeal in its own right. It had been halted again and again by orders from above, sent back once to collect the battalion commander. It had been forced to cross a creek swollen by the monsoon into a brown torrent that rose over the tops of the vehicles, the carriers spinning and turning and very nearly foundering in the flood before they hauled themselves out the far side. It had fought its way through the enemy's flanking battalion in the failing light, the troopers and the infantry on top trading fire at close range, with an enemy that rose up out of the scrub all around them. And then, at around 10 minutes past 7, the carriers burst into the rubber behind Delta Company and swept across the front of the position with their heavy machine guns hammering. And the enemy, who had spent the better part of 4 hours and many hundreds of his men trying to overrun a single company and failing, finally broke off the fight and faded back into the gathering dark. The other companies came up on foot, the guns lifted and reached out after the retreating enemy. And a terrible silence settled over the plantation, broken only by the rain and the moaning of the wounded. And 108 men who had walked into the rubber that afternoon began, slowly, to discover how many of them were still alive. Nobody at headquarters believed they had won. In the darkness, as Delta Company counted itself by feel and by voice, the figures that came back were the figures of catastrophe. 15 men were missing, swallowed by the rubber where 11 platoon had made its stand. The dead and the wounded were carried out to a clearing at the edge of the plantation and lifted away by helicopter through the rain, an American aircraft first, taking the worst cases, and then a string of Australian ones flying without lights, while the survivors lay in the mud and listened to the night and waited for the attack they were certain would come again before dawn. The fear in those hours was not only for themselves, it was for the 15 who were missing, because every man there understood what capture meant in this war, and the thought of their friends lying wounded and alone out in the rubber, beyond help, was a weight no order could lift. To get the survivors out, the carriers formed a box around them in the dark, and opened their hatches and turned on their interior lights to guide the helicopters down. And the men who walked out behind the vehicles held onto the webbing of the man in front so as not to be lost in the blackness. At the task force headquarters, the mood was a funeral. The early reports spoke of a company that might no longer exist as a fighting force, of 25 dead and 40 wounded. Figures that were revised through the night, but never into anything that looked like a victory. And at one point, the task force commander walked to a chair, sat down heavily, and put his head in his hands. When his own superior suggested, gently, that Delta Company be spared the ordeal of going back into the plantation in the morning, that some other unit do the grim work of recovery, Harry Smith refused outright, with a flat insistence that allowed no argument. They were his men out there in the rubber. His company, and no other, would be the one to go back for them. So, in the gray light of the 19th of August, Delta Company walked back into the place that had so nearly destroyed it, leading a larger force cautiously into the silent plantation, and the morning gave back, one by one, the men the night had taken. They found Barry Mellor alive, badly wounded, propped against a rubber tree and weakly waving. They found Jim Richmond alive in the mud, terribly hurt, calling out a sergeant's name into the rain, having lain there through the entire night, having prayed for the first time in years and promised God he would return to church if only he survived, a promise he would later confess, with the dry, unsentimental honesty of his kind, that he broke the moment he got home. When the search party reached him and he heard Buick's voice, Richmond said afterward that the sergeant wasn't a handsome man, but that he could almost have kissed him that morning. And then they found the rest of 11 platoon, 13 of them, lying where they had fought and fallen in their firing positions, their weapons still pointing outward toward the enemy, their fingers still curled around their triggers, the night's long rain having rinsed them clean, so that they seemed, in that first unbearable instant, only to be resting between actions. Grown men who had survived the battle stood and wept at the sight of it. These were soldiers they had trained alongside and lived beside and known for a year, and they had died facing the right way, holding a line that had no business being held, and the image of them lying there in the clean morning light would never wholly leave the men who found them. The longer the morning wore on, the more the true scale of what they had done revealed itself, and the harder it became for anyone to keep calling it a disaster. The count of enemy dead climbed through the day, past 100, past 160, past 180, rising toward the figure of 245 that would eventually be set down in the record. And even that number was frozen only because a deadline had been imposed, and a line had to be drawn somewhere, while more bodies and more graves were found in the rubber for 2 weeks afterward, and never added to the official tally. Drag marks ran away through the trees in every direction, the trails of dead and wounded hauled off the battlefield by an enemy who almost never abandoned his own. And scattered across the plantation lay something stranger and more telling still, a great litter of abandoned weapons, more than 30 assault rifles, machine guns, rocket launchers, recoilless rifles, the costly tools of war that this enemy was famous for recovering at any price, left where they had fallen because the men who carried them had not lived to take them away. When General William Westmoreland, the commander of the entire American war effort in Vietnam, flew in to see the battlefield for himself, it was because nobody could quite credit that 108 men had done this, and he needed to stand in the rubber and look at it with his own eyes. He found Australian soldiers digging graves for the men they had killed, and when he remarked to one of them that this was the dirty part of the job, the digger told him, with the flat, cheerful fatalism of his country, that it would be all right, that they could handle it, and the line ran in newspapers around the world. And the cost had been 18 Australians killed and 24 wounded, something close to a third of Delta Company, the heaviest single blow any Australian unit would suffer in that war. Back at Nui Dat, the survivors returned to tent lines full of empty bunks, and in the tent he had shared with Gordon Sharp, Dave Sabin sat and stared for a long while at the half of the tent that was now simply an empty bed. Almost everything about Long Tan that feels certain has been argued over ever since, and an honest account has to sit with the argument rather than wave it away. The first dispute is about what the battle even was. For decades it was described as an ambush, the Australians lured into a carefully laid trap, and many of the men who fought there reject that word with real heat, because an ambush means an enemy waiting in concealment to spring a surprise, and Delta Company was not so much waited for as collided with. The two sides shocked to find each other in the rubber, the leading enemy soldiers cut down before they could even bring their weapons up. Yet the Vietnamese commanders, interviewed long after the war by an Australian veteran who became a historian, suggested something more deliberate, a plan to draw the new and untested Australians out of their base and fight them on ground and, at a moment of the enemy's own choosing, closing fast to get in among the soldiers where the artillery could not safely follow, a tactic the Vietnamese used precisely to rob their enemies of their greatest advantage. The truth most likely lives in the space between a plan and its violent collision with reality, and it is more interesting than either tidy legend. The second dispute is about the numbers, and it cuts both ways. The Australian count of 245 enemy dead has been challenged by Vietnamese sources that record far fewer of their own killed, and it sat for years against the wartime propaganda of Hanoi, which absurdly claimed to have wiped out an entire Australian battalion of 1,000 men. A small number of Australian writers have argued that the official toll was inflated, and that the victory owed more to the guns and the armor than to the infantry. And that argument deserves a hearing, even though it sits well outside the consensus of those who have studied the battle most closely. Against it stands the patient work of a retired brigadier who has identified by name close to 200 of the enemy dead from Vietnamese records, and the plain physical evidence of all those abandoned weapons and drag marks, and the simple fact that the enemy regiment was rendered ineffective in the province for a long time afterward. What is not in dispute by anyone on any side is the conduct of the men who held the line. And here the story turns from the battle to the thing that came after it, which is in some ways harder to forgive than anything the enemy did in the rubber. 2 weeks after Long Tan, the government of South Vietnam, understanding that something extraordinary had taken place in Phuoc Tuy, arranged to decorate the Australians who had fought there. The ceremony was set, the men were assembled, those chosen for awards were standing ready, and then, at almost the last possible moment, word came down from Australia that the country's long-standing policy was not to accept foreign honors, and so the soldiers who had been selected for gallantry awards were instead presented with dolls in Vietnamese national dress, along with cigarette cases and lighters. Men who had stood against a regiment in the mud walked away from the parade holding souvenir dolls and tried, with the black humor that is the soldier's last defense, to convince their disbelieving mates that they really had been decorated for Long Tan. It would be a funny story if it were not the first clear sign of a pattern that would shadow these men for the next 40 years. The honors system that governed them ran on quotas, a fixed and miserly imperial allocation of medals, and there were never going to be enough to go around to match what Delta Company had actually done. Harry Smith had been recommended for a high decoration for his leadership in the battle, and it was quietly downgraded. Across the company, the recognition that came was thinner and slower than the men present that day believed their friends had earned, and the sense of it, the sense of having been treated shabbily by the people in Canberra, settled over the survivors and would not lift. Nothing in the long, unhappy aftermath cut deeper than what happened to Big Jack Kirby, the man who had seemed invincible at Long Tan, who had walked the perimeter through 4 hours of fire as though the bullets were someone else's problem, who had killed a machine gun crew with his own hands and carried wounded boys to the aid post and joked the terror out of frightened privates, did not die in battle against the enemy at all. On the 6th of February, 1967, less than half a year after Long Tan, a salvo of New Zealand artillery fell short onto his company's position during another operation, and Jack Kirby was killed by the same kind of guns that had saved them all in the rubber. Not killed by the enemy, killed by his own side, by the artillery that was meant to protect him, in an accident that took 4 other Australians with him. The medical officer who had seen him at Long Tan said that Kirby had appeared invincible there, that he had become a kind of mascot and good luck charm for the whole company, and now the charm was gone. Many of those who had been in the rubber, and his own commander-chief among them, believed to the end of their days that Jack Kirby had earned the Victoria Cross at Long Tan, the highest award their country could bestow, and he never received it, in life or in death. What he received was the love of the soldiers who had served under him, and a grave, and a place near the very top of a long list of injustices that one stubborn man would spend the rest of his life trying to set right. That man was Harry Smith, and he left the army, but he never left Long Tan. For decade after decade, he wrote the letters and lodged the submissions, and fought through the reviews, and harried the politicians and the defense bureaucracy, refusing to let the matter rest, refusing to accept that the recognition his men had been denied in 1966 could not be put right. And slowly, far too slowly, the country gave ground. In 2008, his own downgraded award was finally restored to its proper level, recognized as the high decoration for leadership and gallantry it should always have been, and 2 of his platoon commanders received the medals for gallantry. They should have been given 4 decades earlier. The following year, the company itself was honored with a unit citation for gallantry, and the Air Force pilot who had led the ammunition resupply through the storm was at last awarded the decoration he had properly been recommended for in 1966. And in 2011, on the 45th anniversary of the battle, more than 80 of the surviving men of Delta Company paraded before the Governor-General at Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane, in the very place where their battalion had been born, to receive at last the recognition that should have been theirs from the beginning. The United States had not waited so long. President Lyndon Johnson had awarded Delta Company a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism within a year of the battle, and it remains a strange and telling fact that the soldiers of an Australian company were honored by a foreign president before their own country could bring itself to honor them. The battle lives on now in a handful of places, and in the arguments that still gather around it like weather. On the 3rd anniversary, the 18th of August, 1969, the men of the battalion erected a simple white cross on the site where they had fought, and that cross became only the 2nd foreign war memorial ever permitted to stand on Vietnamese soil, the other marking the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. It was taken down after the communist victory in 1975, reused for a time to mark a priest's grave, and recovered years later and given a place in a provincial museum, and a replica stands on the battlefield still, one of the most quietly powerful objects the whole war produced. The anniversary of Long Tan became Vietnam Veterans Day across Australia, the day on which the entire country's long and divided and unhappy war is now remembered, so that one afternoon in one rubber plantation came to carry the weight of an entire conflict on its shoulders. In 2019, the battle reached the cinema in a film that recreated its conditions with real fidelity, and in doing so, it reopened the old debates, because some historians warned that to show the enemy only as a faceless wave breaking endlessly on Australian courage was to flatten a more complicated truth, and to forget that the men on the other side had skill and discipline and purpose of their own. Even the act of remembering has been contested. Australian commemorations at the site itself have repeatedly run up against Vietnamese sensitivities, most sharply when the 50th anniversary events were very nearly cancelled altogether. And scholars have gently pointed out that Australia has folded Long Tan so completely into its national legend that the folding can crowd out both the complexity of the battle and the people whose country it actually was. What remains, when the arguments are all set aside, are the men. Gordon Sharp, the television cameraman who drew his platoon forward and died at the throat, never went home to Tamworth. The Brisbane boys, the butcher, and the blinds installer, and the student who had not finished his degree, never came home to the city that had raised their battalion. Jack Kirby, who had survived the impossible afternoon and seemed for one bright moment as though nothing could touch him, never came home at all, killed 5 months later by the guns that had once been his salvation. They were not professional warriors, most of them. They were ordinary young men, chosen by a barrel and a birthday, who walked into a rubber plantation on an afternoon they would much rather have spent at a concert, and who held a line they had every reason in the world to abandon, and who proved good enough to die for a country that then took 40 years to decide how to thank them for it. That distance between what these men were asked to do and how long it took to honor the doing of it is the truest measure of Australia's Vietnam, and it is written out in full at Long Tan. The cross still stands in the rubber, the anniversary still comes around every August, and the rain still falls on Phuoc Tui every wet season, on ground that has long since forgotten the young men who bled into it, though their own country, in the end, after far too long, has finally tried to remember. If you believe these men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand the battle that Australia spent 40 years arguing about how to honor, watch this next.